Greetings, everybody, and thank you for making time for this important conversation. Following Claire and Chris, I'm reminded of a moment during the South African liberation struggle. By the way, greetings from South Africa. I'm talking to you quite late in the evening from here, where if you follow two presentations like the one that you just heard from Claire and Chris, you started by saying, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been eloquently made by the previous speaker. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 2 hours. Given that I have very few minutes, let me get to the point. The first point is why civil disobedience critically is necessary now. And that is because humanity has entered the most consequential decade in the history of humanity. What we do in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future or whether we will have a future at all. We are still in a situation where there is massive cognitive dissonance and denial about the fact that we are right on the climate cliff, and we are literally 2 minutes to midnight, and still what we have from those in power, whether it's corporate power or political power, is largely baby steps in the right direction, incremental tinkering here and there, when in fact, given how long they've dragged the feet, how long the science was falsified by the fossil fuel industry and others and so on, this is a catch-up time, right? That's the first point. The second is, why do we need civil disobedience? If history teaches us anything, whenever humanity has faced a major injustice or a major challenge, those struggles only moved forward when decent people stood up and said, enough is enough. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to put our lives on the line if necessary. And I want to suggest that the climate challenge, the climate danger, the climate catastrophe we are facing is in a sense more important a challenge than all the other struggles combined. Because what we are talking about here is whether we'll even be able to live to fight another day to ensure that we get gender equality. What we are talking about here is whether we will be able to live to ensure that we get a world of greater economic equity, for example. But it is critically important that we recognize that civil disobedience has played a critically important role, and that where we are today, we need to be very strategic in how we think about civil disobedience. Firstly, we need to recognize that civil disobedience is contextual. What works well in one place does not necessarily work well in another place. So for example, I'm not sure whether everybody on the call is familiar with mooning, you know, where you pull your pants down and show your backside and you can write a slogan like, stop the extinction and so on. Now that might work well in maybe US or Europe. It might not work so well in Saudi Arabia or in say, Indonesia. Okay, so understanding that, especially in a global movement, for us to be able to be very strategic, to understand that civil disobedience is communicating to multiple constituencies. I would argue that often civil disobedience is communicating to our people, to ensure that our people can see our outrage and identify with that outrage. But we have to project what we are doing in a way that brings people closer to us. I have been working with a lot of young people over the last couple of months, and I threw a challenge to them, which I throw a challenge to you. And that is, if the climate movement can come up with the climate justice equivalent of taking a knee, what taking a knee is to the issue of structural racism, we need to be also able to come up with ways we can communicate to people so that the hard fought actions that we execute are not portrayed and contaminated in a way that is that we never intended. So I would put to you that the biggest danger facing our collective effort and facing civil disobedience activities in particular is not the repressive state apparatus. It's not the army, the police, and the use of formal laws. I would argue it is more the ideological state apparatus, as Chris very eloquently pointed out. So it's the framework for education, the framework for religion, and most importantly, the framework for media. So civil disobedience has to understand that infrastructure as deeply as we can and strategically as we can if we are going to make a difference. The other point I would like to make is it's very important that those of us who are comfortable with engaging with civil disobedience do so with humility, with love, and with compassion. And we must do it with also respecting those that might not yet be ready to engage in civil disobedience. Because bear in mind, my experience in South Africa as a young activist is the person who joined and only did bake sales and raised money for certain protests. 3 to 5 years later, that's the person who's going to be in a frontline action. So it is really important that we understand why people might be hesitant to engage in civil disobedience. And I'm going to say something now that might be very unpopular. The challenge for us in the United States, for example, is whether we can develop the capability, the narrative, the communication tools, and the resistance activities that can win over the people that voted for Donald Trump. Just because they voted for a fascist, we must not write them out, right? We need to understand how they were manipulated so that they would actually arrive at that point, right? So it's critically important that we also, as your respect statement correctly said, that we value different people's efforts. Now, I want to note that the communications challenge around civil disobedience in the United States becomes somewhat complicated. Doesn't affect it in substance at all, but it challenges us to be very strategic in the light of the uncivil disobedience that we saw on January 6th, right? The act of insurrection and so on, because we have to think about how we play this, because in the minds of people on the receiving end, and you can be sure that the media infrastructure in the United States will very quickly try, once we build momentum, numbers, scale, and so on, they will try to portray it in that same veil. I want to conclude by just saying that in a context of COVID, I want to just endorse very strongly what Chris said, is critique of the current economic system, and just make this point, that I believe that the biggest disease that we are facing, which impacts on climate and every other injustice that we face, is a disease that is worse than COVID, and a disease that we could call affluenza, which is a pathological illness where people are led to believe that a good, meaningful, decent life comes from more and more and more and more material acquisition. Unless we can break that logic, which exists very well in civil society as well. It's not that those of us in civil society are immune from affluenza, right? But unless we can address the unequal consumption patterns within our countries, within our communities, and between rich and poor countries, we do not have a chance to actually deliver genuine climate justice. I want to conclude with the words of Martin Luther King when he said, speaking in 1965, he said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to." He goes on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, and importantly on the economy," he says, "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. If that was relevant to the United States in 1965, it's 1,000 times more relevant today, not only to the United States, but to all of us around the world. If we do not address the unequal consumption, the broken economic system, and the capture of power by a very tiny elite in most of our countries, If we do not take on those big tasks with boldness and with civil disobedience playing a critical role, I don't think, given where things are now, we stand a chance for success. Thank you very much.